So, let's just go with the basics to begin with. The creation model, if you read your Bibles, you know it says that God created the universe and everything in it in 6 days, rested on the seventh day. Man was created in the image of God. The last major creative work of God was to make us, and we are different. He breathed in us the Holy Spirit of life. He made us separately from the animals and made us in the image of God. We are unique, we are special, despite what some secularists would say that we're nothing special, right? But this is the creation model. So why is there sin and death and disease in the world? Sin. And you can read about that account. That is the reason. And also, as sin got rampant in the early world, in the early earth, and culture, God had to hit the reset button and cause a worldwide flood. But the point here is relatively recent creation and that God spoke all things into existence. And that's the thing to remember. The alternative model, the one that's taught in our schools, you'll see on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, everywhere else, the evolutionary model. And about 15 billion years ago, nothing created something. The universe exploded into existence, making matter, and of course some of the energy that we now have. It took a while, but 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth formed from swirling gases about the same time as the Sun and the rest of the planets. And then about 900 million years later, the first life popped into existence all by itself in some primordial soup. Somewhere on the planet it happened, the first living cell. And then from there, death has always been part of the story. Death is part of the evolutionary process. You all remember that. Carl Sagan said, death and accident, death and accident, death and accident. That's how we got here today. Totally different than the creative process in the creation model. So that's a key difference to hang on to. And of course, humans evolved from ape-like creatures. And instead of God speaking everything into existence, it's time, chance, and natural processes, no supernatural force needed. Well, this whole idea of millions of years is everywhere. And of course, it's required in that evolutionary secular model. It's required. They have to hang on to the millions and billions of years. I was even watching a SpongeBob SquarePants cartoon with my son over 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And they had an episode teaching billions of years. They talked about where SpongeBob SquarePants came from and that he evolved over millions of years. It's everywhere. It's teaching our kids, and it's taught to our kids, and it just permeates our culture. So the question I have for you to begin with, as we look at this, how old are rocks? Driving up here, you see a lot of rocks along the road. We see them everywhere, obviously. Some beautiful polished rocks right here in this beautiful chapel. So there's some rocks. How old is this rock? So you could even see some fossils in them. How old is the formation of these rocks with fossils? Did it occur billions of years ago? Millions of years ago? Thousands of years ago? Or just decades? What do you think? The standard answer is going to be billions, maybe hundreds of millions, right? That would be the answer. But how about this rock? This is a rock. Now, it looks like a hat, but you went up and pick it up, it is rock, totally calcified. Do you think this rock is billions of years, millions of years, thousands of years, or decades? Now, I would say that first rock, with the fossils of deep sea creatures and plants, was actually thousands of years old. This one we know is decades. This was a miner's hat, a felt hat that was left in an underwater, or in a mine that filled with water and got totally calcified when it was rediscovered about 50 years later. Just a matter of decades to make rock. So what I want to do for you tonight is see that science, now I'm talking about the facts of science, not scientists. I know the majority of scientists and many of my Christian brothers and sisters will insist on millions and billions of years. But what I want to show you tonight is so that the science, the real science, does not require millions of years, but rather, where it comes from, it is a necessity of what's called uniformitarian geology and evolutionary theory. After all, if you don't have the billions of years, nobody's going to believe Darwin's story. Because nobody's going to say, well, that could just, you could go from a worm-like creature in the sea into a T-Rex in just a matter of thousands of years. Nobody's going to believe that. But if you throw enough time at it, we're told, well, anything is possible. I had a biology professor tell me that. I was trying to set up a debate with him, and when he said that, I said, well, yeah, that's good. But that sounds more like a statement of faith than science. Anyway, rocks. How old are the rocks? Now, the idea of rocks being very ancient, of course, is based on what's called the varves, the very tiny, millimeter, 2 to 3 millimeter thickness of tiny sediments in layers and giant layers of rocks, from the Grand Canyon to what you see around here. And the story is that a lot of these were laid down in a shallow sea, and it accumulated over time. Or a small lake, like you have, I heard you had a few lakes here in Minnesota, right? Well, at the bottom of these lakes are sediments, very thin layers, and you get enough of them. The idea was that you could count them like tree rings. So in this cliff, with the pretty eroded varves or rock layers, somebody might say, well, that's probably at least a few 100,000 years. Maybe not quite a billion or million because it's not that tall, but if you go underneath, you get to the millions of years. So you get these tiny layers, might take hundreds of years, and eventually you can get millions and billions. That was the original idea, and that the present is the key to the past. How many of you heard that phrase? You're familiar with that? Okay, we got a few familiar with that. And that came from Charles Lyell and some others, a Hutton, a Scotsman named Hutton, 100 years before Lyell. But Lyell is the guy that really pushed what we now call the uniformitarian view of geology, that everything that's happening today, and these processes have been uniform for millions of years. The same processes, slow sedimentary buildup of the rocks. Now before that, we had the cataclysmic view, basically that Noah's flood created these rocks and killed all the fossils that's in them. That's where those rocks and fossils came from. And even during the time of Lyell and Darwin, there were a group of geologists, people who studied rocks just like Lyell and others, but said, wait a minute, this really does make more sense to be explained by Noah's flood. They have been called the scriptural geologists, and that there was this major cataclysm as described in the Bible, called Noah's flood. But that's only 4,500 years ago, or 6,000. You can round it up into that area. But we're talking thousands, not millions or billions. Well, Charles Lyell was actually a London lawyer, and he tried to put together the whole idea of uniformitarian geology. He wrote 3 books. Darwin took those books with him around the world. Basically, he said, slow and gradual geological processes, and that Noah's flood never happened. Lyell set out, and this is documented in many books, his whole purpose, he had an agenda, was to prove the Bible wrong. And he knew he could not take a direct attack or do a direct attack on the gospel or anything more recent. That didn't work. But if you just created a story of millions of years, even hundreds thousand years at that time, was enough to get people doubting the 6,000 number that they figured from the genealogies and modern history from Genesis and so on. So what we have is a whole timeline of modern doubt, doubting the Bible. Not an attack on the gospel per se, but if you could undermine Genesis 1 through 11, you would eventually erode the whole foundation of Christianity. And that was Lyell's goal. That's documented in his letters and other things that he has left behind. In the 1600s, there were many geologists and scriptural geologists who said, yeah, man, we look around, these rocks are about 6,000 years old, and that they are full of fossils because of Noah's flood. Of course, James Hutton, I mentioned him. He was a Scotsman. He said that we have to explain geology and the rocks by the natural processes, by what is happening now. That was 1795, one of his books. Then in the 1830s, Charles Lyell published the Principles of Geology, and Darwin took those books. He got the first one with him, and then he had others shipped to him as he traveled around the world for 5 years. Darwin actually began as an amateur geologist and later switched to biology. Of course, 1859, he published his Origin of Species, and the work for almost a generation of getting people to doubt in 6,000 years, getting people to believe in millions, if not millions, at least hundreds of thousands of years, and not the biblical account of Genesis, had already been laid. And that deep time was necessary for people now to jump on Darwin's ideas in biology and convince the world that you don't need God for everything we see in the world. And then, of course, a friend of Darwin over in Germany, Haeckel, he came up with his embryo ideas, and that actually is still on textbooks, but we know is based on fraud, that we evolved and that we have this embryonic recapitulation where we go through every phase of our evolutionary past, where the embryo goes through the various stages, a frog phase, a lizard phase, a chicken phase, a fish phase is in there, whatever the right sequence, but he had these embryonic drawings. Of course, we know he faked them. He faked, didn't matter. People wanted to believe him, and they're still around today. Now, some of you have heard of carbon-14 dating, and we're going to get into that. That didn't get developed until the 1950s. It was before that we have some of the other types of radiometric dating, as Madame Curie and others discovered how to measure the radioactivity and what it was causing that. But getting back to Lyell, he's the one who laid the groundwork for this. Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionist from Harvard, and as he looked at this, he said this about Charles Lyell. He said, his book is one of the most brilliant briefs published by an advocate, a lawyer. Lyell relied upon true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. First, he set up a straw man to demolish. In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. In other words, the scriptural guys trying to look at the rocks, they were actually using science, but Lyell had the better story. Because, as we found out, the geologic record does seem to require catastrophes, that the uniformitarian view does not work well. So, one quick message I have, if you believe in millions of years, I don't mean to demean anybody, but if you do, I would think, or I kind of think, that you've been had. You've been tricked by a London lawyer. And that's exactly what Charles Lyell goal has been. It's not because he had hard scientific evidence, as we're going to see. The last decades have seen lots of great evidence coming forward, and we're going to get into it. But I do want to reference 2 Peter 3. St. Peter is near the end of his life. He writes a 3-chapter book, and one of them is to remember, remember, remember. His point is to remember not just the days of creation, but also sin and our need for a Savior. But he also makes it clear, remember Noah's flood. That it really did happen. The world at that time was destroyed by water. And in chapter 3, Peter says, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? All continues just as it was from creation. All continues just as it was. That's the uniformitarian view, that everything, all the processes we see geologically and otherwise, are slow and gradual and uniform processes just like we have today. I think that's a 2 Peter prediction or prophecy of what's going on in the world in the last 100 years or so. And Peter goes on, For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice the world at that time, the past, was destroyed, being flooded with water. So Peter is admonishing the church to remember Noah's flood. And that's not a topic we talk a lot about, and we do have a lot of what I call flood geology and others, geologists that have looked at everything. We've got materials back there if you're interested, but really show that the world really was flooded with water. See, what Lyell and his followers didn't know is that there are marine fossils at the top of all the mountains. We've got mollusks and seafloor plants at the top of the Himalayas and the Rockies in that sedimentary stone. So obviously these rocks were formed in water, and it's all over the earth. They also didn't know about fossil graveyards. We've got graveyards all over the earth, dinosaur bones and other creatures, and intermingled, again, are seafloor animals and plants, as if it was all buried in a flood in one catastrophic event and not laid down over millions of years. They also didn't know how fossils are formed. You only get fossils with rapid burial. And this one is shown of a plesiosaur actually giving birth. You know, mama had to stop and do that and got swamped. Whoosh. Tons of sediment that an underground tsunami at the bottom is all this material being moved and then just got buried rapidly. And that is the only way to get fossils, is rapid burial and deep burial. Otherwise, things rot. If a fish dies and drops to the bottom of a Minnesota lake, do you get fossils? No, you should have billions of them at the bottom of your lakes, right? Because fish die all the time. But everything gets eaten up, including the bones. And any remains goes to the bottom of the lake, and the mud layers is full of microbes that dissolve and clean up everything that's left. So what does all this mean? This 19th century belief in uniformitarian geology and what everybody was now being taught, well, it really sets the stage for millions and billions of years. Andrew Knoll, a Harvard paleobiologist, said, "The great achievement of the 19th century science was learning to use fossils as distinctive time indicators. That allowed this wonderful scale to come into being." What scale is that? That's the geologic time column. Okay, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Others have said this: you see, the rocks date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic time column had not been erected first. What does that mean? Well, it's really the point I'm trying to make here from a little bit of history is that the belief in millions of years was not based on empirical science. They didn't come to this conclusion because of facts and data. They came to it because they wanted to do it, and as Lyell and his friends did, discredit the Bible. It was based on an agenda to do just that. That's where the deep time really comes from. Not because, oh, we discovered radiometric dating, and therefore we believe in billions of years. No. Radiometric dating came along later, and some of the methods were actually hand-picked in the 20th century after they've already decided to believe in millions of years. And it was the methods were picked because it seemed to indicate the long ages that they wanted as the answer. But the thing is, the more we've delved into radiometric dating, we get inconsistent results. It's not as good as they want us to believe. And indeed, they'll throw out these numbers and say, well, this comes from this method. You've got to believe it. But the key here is faulty assumptions. You cannot know everything there is you need to know to make some of the calculations based on the readings you get of uranium and lead, for example, and then come up with an actual definite answer. You need some assumptions, and here are some of them about the main radiometric dating. First, you need to know something about the original amount of the mother element, parent and daughter. elements. For example, uranium turns to lead. Lead is the daughter element from this radioactive decay. How much uranium was there when the rock formed? Yeah, we can take a sample today and get a pretty good, very good analysis of how much uranium and lead is in there today. But do you know how much was there when that rock formed? Was it all uranium and no lead? Could have been a lot of lead. So one of the assumptions you have to make is how much of the startup or the mother element do you have? How much of the daughter element is in that sample when it formed? Second is, this is a big one, well, this has not been disturbed for billions of years. These rocks are in water. We know uranium and lead will leach in and out of the rocks. So what we measure today may not be a result of just the radioactive decay going on, but it might be that lead came into the system, or it might have had a lot more lead to begin with. We really don't know. Secondly, we can get an idea, even though it may take hundreds of millions of years, we get an idea of what the half-life is of some of these radioactive materials, but we really can't say that they've been constant all this time. In fact, we'll give you some evidence near the end of this talk on how much time, indicators that the decay rate has actually been accelerated in the past. But that is a great assumption. You have to make all these assumptions before you get something. And let's give you a quick example. Potassium-argon has always been used on lava and volcanic ash because of the where it's found and the decay rate of potassium to argon. The problem is argon has been found in present fresh lava. So that totally throws out all the nice calculations and measurements you make. Potassium-argon has actually been used for dating a lot of different samples and convincing people of millions of years because they assumed that there was no argon gas in the rock when that lava first solidified. And then they maybe threw in a little bit. But now we've got all kinds of it, and it's variable. So it really, if you ever hear somebody talk about potassium-argon, what we know today means a lot of those numbers are not good. They are not reliable. In fact, I'll give you some other reasons why they're not reliable. So when it comes to bones and fossils, do we dig up fossils and do they have a tag? This fossil was formed 65 million years ago. Another thing is we cannot use radiometric dating on none of these long-age radiometric dating techniques on neither the fossils nor the sedimentary rock that they're found in. Okay? I want you to remember that. So how do they date fossils? Well, mostly it's done through index fossils. That's what I was getting at before, the geological time column. And they started 100 years ago, put together books and tables saying, I got this layer of rock and it's got a dinosaur bone in it. I have no way of dating the dinosaur bone directly, but I do find this fossil in the same layer. It's one of the index fossils. So I go to my book, and the book says, why, this must be 66 to 70 million years old because of the index fossil, where it fits into this time column. But how do you know that that fossil is that old? Well, because we find it in this rock column. Well, how do you know the rock column or strata is that old? Because we find this fossil. Well, how do you know the fossil is that old? Because it's in this rock layer. It really is. You can, once you strip away all the jargon and all the fancy stuff, it really gets down to circular reasoning. And most fossils are dated with what's called index fossils because you cannot use a radiometric dating technique on the sedimentary rock or the fossil itself. But then we have carbon-14, but we'll get into that. Now, you heard I was an engineer. I was basically in design, test, and manufacture, mostly manufacturing. And maybe, well, let's see, how long has it been? Getting over 30 years now. A very key book came out in manufacturing management, factory management, called the goal. How many of you heard of just-in-time manufacturing or lean manufacturing? Well, the goal is one of the classics. And we all had to read that in the 1980s. And I came across this quote on page 157. The goal is unique in that it's not just a typical consultant's book. Do this, do that, here's a list of things. It's actually a story. It's a story of a failing business, and a consultant comes in. The consultant is named Jonah, and the Jonah and Alex, the owner of the business, have this continuous talk and stories and samples and things going on in Alex's life and so on. It's a very entertaining book. But at one point, the consultant Jonah says to Alex, "When I was a physicist, people would come to me from time to time with problems in mathematics that they couldn't solve. They wanted me to check their numbers for them." A lot of advanced math, and he could check it. "But," Jonah says, "after a while, I learned not to waste my time checking the numbers because the numbers were almost always right. However, if I checked the assumptions, they were almost always wrong." That is so important in just general life, in manufacturing consulting, and in this area. If you check the assumptions, are they really good? And that's what's going on here. That's what as an engineer, an engineering manager, I'm going to say, well, okay, that's an interesting calculation, nothing wrong with that. Arithmetic is good. But along the way, you've got to make a lot of assumptions many times to plug in numbers where you just don't know. And maybe sometimes you can get statistics and data, marketing data, test data, but you'd be surprised how much time somebody just puts in a guess. It might be an educated guess, but it still is a guess. It's an assumption to try to back up the conclusion. For those of you who want to know a little bit about radiometric dating methods, carbon-14 is totally different than the ones at long ages that I've been talking about. Carbon-14 is only good for something up to 80,000 years. How many of you heard somebody say radiocarbon, carbon-14, and millions of years in the same sentence? Yeah, a good third of you at least. Well, now you know you've got them. They don't know their science. Carbon-14 can only be used up to about 80,000 years, maybe a little bit more with the instruments we have. And it can only be used on something that was once alive, and I'll get into that. And its presence, if you've got carbon-14, that means it's less than 80,000 years old, and it rules out millions of years. The long ages, those are the radiometric ones like uranium, lead, potassium-argon, and rubidium, strontium that we've mentioned. You know, that's where you get the hundreds of thousands of years to billions. But that's only good on igneous and metamorphic rock, not sedimentary rock where the fossils are found. And it's always full of those assumptions I mentioned. And you know what? And I'll give you some examples. If you can actually check the ages of some of these radiometric methods, they're always wrong. And there's always conflicts between them. You could take the same rock, send it to different labs, use the same method, and get pretty different results. And different results from rubidium or uranium will give you different results. So it's not as consistent, it's not as good. And in fact, secular geologists or paleontologists trying to date something, if they don't like the results, they know that they're not held to these, so they throw them out. If it's close to what the answer they want, they'll put it in the footnotes. And if it matches their assumptions, well, they'll say, well, see, I used uranium lead. But in another study on a different topic, a different sample, they don't even mention it because it gave them the wrong answer. So it does have bad results. There's a lot of problems with it. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about carbon-14. Remember, none of these methods can be used on sedimentary rocks. We've got sandstone, and which no method is used on directly. We do have ash, which is volcanic material, so that's where they have been using potassium-argon method. And if you find a little bit of volcanic ash or a little lava or something from a volcano in the sedimentary rock, because we know volcanoes were going off throughout Noah's flood event, you are going to find that. And that's where they say, okay, I got a little bit of potassium that I can do some volcanic material. I'm going to do potassium-argon on it, and it's going to give me these long ages. And then they say that whole rock strata is that old, if they like the answer. Otherwise, they'll use index fossils, as I mentioned. And then the volcanic basalt, that's just another feature of the Grand Canyon. It's like the volcanic ash. It will give you radically different answers than other methods used. But let's concentrate on carbon-14, because I said it can be only used on something that was once alive, including the fossils that are in the various sedimentary rocks. And of course, Lyell had no idea about this. It wasn't developed until the 1950s. Dr. Libby got a Nobel Prize for developing carbon-14 dating. And basically, where does carbon-14 come from? It occurs when cosmic rays hit nitrogen in the atmosphere. Nitrogen has an atomic weight of 14, but it loses some electrons, and then it becomes carbon-14. Radioactive carbon, radiocarbon. But carbon-14 can act like normal carbon and combine with oxygen and make a CO2. So this CO2 with carbon-14 is out there in the air we're breathing, mixed in with normal carbon throughout the atmosphere, and then it enters the entire food chain. So plants take in normal CO2 as well as carbon-14 type CO2, and it's in there. And we've all got about the same amount. Because even if you're just a vegetarian, you're going to be breathing it in the atmosphere, the little bit of it that's there, but you're also getting it from the plants because the plants take in the CO2. And if you eat meat, well, they eat the plants, and that's part of the food chain too. So basically, as long as something's alive, plant and animals, it has about the same amount of carbon-14 as in the atmosphere, okay? But when something dies, while it has the same ratio of carbon-14 in the atmosphere at that point, it stops taking in carbon-14. Doesn't breathe, doesn't take food, whatever, right? The carbon-14 that's there begins to decay, and the carbon-14 has a short half-life. It's only good for 80,000 years, because then after that we cannot measure it. It's basically gone. So what we try to do when we find the sample, it could have been a tree that stopped taking in carbon-14 when it was cut down, or some plant samples, or some bones of an animal. We can do carbon-14 testing on them. But we can see how much carbon-14 is left in it now compared to the atmosphere today. And it's always going to be less, especially if it's been, hundreds of years or more. And then we compare it to what is in the atmosphere. I need to know the starting amount in the fossil. That's the critical detail. This is what's left because it's been decaying, but nothing new is going in because the sample is dead, has been dead for a long time. So we just have to compare it to the start. The half-life is pretty well known, and then it's just simple arithmetic, comparing how much do we have today to the starting amount in the atmosphere, and it's just a straight line calculation. It's the sophisticated stuff of measuring this stuff of carbon-14 that's complicated, but after that it's just arithmetic. But that's the critical detail. So the question is, the critical assumption is, has the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in the atmosphere always been the same? Now there's not much carbon-14, so don't think you're radioactive or anything. It's only 1 trillion to 1, but we can measure it. We can measure it smaller than that. But that's the assumption. Remember what I told you about assumptions? Is there a way to check your assumptions? You see, if the assumption is true that the atmosphere has always had the same amount of carbon-14, then your basic arithmetic is good, and you come up with good answers. But if the assumption is false, then there's some question involved in your answer, right? Now, what do we know about carbon-14 in the atmosphere? You know, for the last decades, 100 years, you know, since we've been able to measure it, less than 100 years, it's pretty stable in that short period of time. But there are some other ways of checking this, and Dr. Libby, who actually developed the method, he assumed that our atmosphere, just like the planet, was billions of years old. Therefore, the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has been stable or at equilibrium for billions of years. Right? Because you have carbon-14 being formed. The carbon-14, even the atmosphere, is decaying. It goes through beta decay back to nitrogen-14 with a half-life of 5,700 years, which isn't long compared to all the methods. But as Dr. Libby looked around and made some more detailed experiments and calculations, he realized that there was a considerable discrepancy in his measurements, indicating that apparently radiocarbon was being created in the atmosphere around 25% faster than it was becoming extinct. Maybe it's not stable. Well, he just assumed, because he believed in billions of years, like most scientists are taught, that it just must be experimental error. And that's what he chalked it up to. Because this is pretty tiny stuff that we have to measure. And that was in the 1950s. Well, later, chemists and other scientists started doing Libby's experiments again. And the new experiments revealed that the discrepancy observed by Libby was not merely an experimental error. It did exist. That means carbon-14 in the atmosphere is not at equilibrium. It really is forming faster than it's decaying. Doesn't that change your whole assumption on carbon-14 calculations? You see, this is a strong indication, despite the errors, that the present natural production rate exceeds the natural decay rate by as much as 25%. And that was published in a Review of Geophysics, a peer-reviewed science journal. And then others have said, as late as 1974, that we know the assumption that the biospheric inventory of carbon-14 has remained constant over the past 50,000 years or so is not true. So all the calculations that come up with carbon-14 dating are based on a bad assumption. So in this case, we've been able to check that out, that the atmosphere, carbon-14 content, is not at equilibrium. You see, this key assumption is false. Now, that doesn't mean carbon-14 has some value, and I'm going to get into that. But basically, the idea is if you assume everything is billions of years old, and Libby calculated that it only took about 30,000 years for cosmic rays to make carbon-14, and then the carbon-14 is decaying, the atmospheric carbon-14 should be at equilibrium within 30,000 years. And then for the next billions of years, it's been constant. Okay? I'm an engineer, I love graphs, so you got the idea though? Okay? So if you find a sample, and it's got this much carbon-14, it's been in equilibrium, and let me go back up. Let's say you find a sample here today, and you measure it, and it's only got a third of the amount of carbon-14 as in the atmosphere. It's just straight line arithmetic going backwards, and you can't go more than 80,000 years because then we can't find any, you don't know how old it is. But you can come up with a number, and which normally do. A carbon-14 analysis of a sample will give you numbers like 12,000 years old, 22,000 years old, 30,000 years old. Never more than 80. Remember that. Carbon-14 cannot be used for more than 80,000 years because it's gone. And then you don't know how long it's been gone. But if it has carbon-14, that's how they get numbers, assuming the atmospheric amount is constant. They calculate it backwards, and I get a sample of 22,000 years. But remember, carbon-14 is not at equilibrium. That means when that tree was cut down, if you've got a wood sample, or the animal died and got buried, and you find these bones, and you try to calculate that, you're overshooting, aren't you? Because you're calculating it, this much carbon-14, and I try to go back and say it's 22,000 years old, because this red line is what the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere today. But remember, that assumption is bad. Maybe the amount of carbon-14 is following more of this yellow line. So that when I do my analysis, and I have carbon-14 and I correct for the atmosphere, I come back and I hit this line, the yellow line, sooner than the red line. You got the idea? So carbon-14 gives us good relative ages. It gives us numbers if it's there, under 80,000 years. But why are these numbers of 22,000 so much more than 6,000, for example? Because of this assumption. If you correct for less carbon-14 in the atmosphere just 3,000 years ago, then you can get answers in your calculation of less than 5,000 years old. Got it? Instead of going back to here, I go back to this yellow line. If I don't understand that carbon-14 in the atmosphere was much less thousands of years ago, then I do overshoot. Instead of 22,000 years, it might only be 4,500 years, or even 3,500 years. And there are qualified scientists doing the estimates how much carbon-14, what this yellow line really might look like, and coming up with numbers less than 6,000 years old based on carbon-14 dating. But I want you to remember two things, okay? Here's just that same example. Here's my sample. I go back, and instead of going back this far, I'm only going back that far. Remember this about carbon-14. If you have it in your sample, and the labs and scientists know how to make sure that there is no contamination, then if you have it, your sample is going to be less than 80,000 years old on the nominal dating, and probably much less when you take into account the atmosphere. So, number one, if I have carbon-14, it rules out millions of years. Even if you want to assume the atmospheric amount has been constant, you've killed the idea of millions and billions of years, because you're only getting answers in the 20 to 30, 40,000 years. You don't even have to correct for the atmosphere. And I'll give you some reasons of some important things that we found. Because carbon-14 is everywhere. In the rate study, they took deep earth diamonds, believed to be over 1 billion years old. Now, a diamond is just, heated and compressed carbon. Carbon that was once coal. And before it was coal, it was probably tree bark or portions of trees, something that's alive. And if it's really billions of years old, these diamonds are going to be a carbon-14 dead for a long time. They should have no carbon-14 left. And yet every time we've taken the diamond, sent it to the lab for testing, it comes back with carbon-14, and the nominal number might be 40,000 years old, not millions and billions. Carbon-14 is actually a young Earth creationist's best friend because it's everywhere, including deep earth diamonds. So remember this, carbon-14 can only be used on organic material, or what that was once organic, like fossils, living things, wood samples buried in the earth, and it wipes out the millions of years. And if you end up with a number like 80,000 or 60,000, you've already wiped out evolutionary theory because it needs the millions and billions. Even if you go with the 70,000, whatever number you want, you've wiped out the millions and billions. So you might as well just go with the Bible, which I think is a good, reliable source. And since we know the assumption of equilibrium is false, then you do get numbers, instead of tens of thousands, you do get numbers under 5 to 6,000. You take that into account. Okay? Carbon-14 primer, you're all experts now. If you hear somebody say carbon-14 and millions of years in the same sentence, you say, oh, wait a minute, carbon-14 can only be used up to 80,000. And if you find it, and you're pretty reasonably sure, just like any other sample, that it has not contamination, like a diamond, which is impossible to contaminate, then you've wiped out millions and billions of years. And we've got diamonds that are supposed to be billions of years old with carbon-14. Remember I told you it took 30,000 years to reach equilibrium? Our atmosphere is not at equilibrium. That means the atmosphere has to be less than 30,000 years old. Oh. Were you taught that? I mean, you saw the quotes in science journals that we know carbon-14 in the atmosphere is not at equilibrium. And everybody agreed with Libby's calculation that after 30,000 years it should be at equilibrium. But it's not. Oops. Let me give you some examples. Rocks that were created in the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. Some of them have been dated, as they take these samples and you send them to the lab and you don't say where you get them from, they come back almost 2 million years old. And yet the rock was formed in the 1980s. There's something wrong with those assumptions, isn't there? Here's another example. Sunset Crater, northern Arizona. Potassium-argon, which I already told you about, dated some rocks there 200,000 years old or more. But then they said, well, you know where this rock came from, Sunset Crater. That rock was formed about 1,000 years ago. And we know when it formed because of the Indians and records of that time in Arizona. Then we got lava flows in New Zealand. Potassium-argon said they're 275,000 years old. Reality? Those rocks were formed when this volcano erupted in 1949, 54, and 75. Oops. And then Hawaii. That's been in the news. We got volcano erupting, shooting up lots of lava, forming new rocks. Potassium-argon of older rock eruptions have come back with dates of over 1 million years, as much as 22 million years old, and yet we know these were taken from lava flows formed in 1801 or less. And another one from Sicily. Again, supposedly 140 to 300,000 years old. Reality, those rocks were formed in 1972 when Mount Etna erupted on the island of Sicily. Wait a minute. There's something wrong here. Here's another conflict. 1993, scientists found wood samples buried in basalt faults. In other words, a tree got caught up in a lava flow, just like it's happening in Hawaii or elsewhere when we have that. Kills the tree. What's left of the wood is in the basalt, the cooled lava. 69 feet. These samples were sent to a lab. The wood encased in the basalt was dated at 44,000 years, okay? That's the straight number with carbon-14. I told you, if it has carbon-14, this wood did, it's always going to be less than 80,000. But then they dated the basalt that's completely encasing the wood sample. And 2 different laboratories dated that at 45 million years old. Now, how do you have a 44,000-year-old, just go with the nominal number, a 1,000-year-old piece of wood, 44,000, surrounded by 45 million-year-old rocks? You see the conundrum? And Cripple Creek, they had another mine there, and they found another wood sample. They dated the wood with the apparent radiocarbon age of 41,000 years old. It has carbon-14. And this is from a fairly deep mine. I think it's in Colorado as well. and it was done, the laboratory was done in Toronto, Canada. Well, the wood has an age of about 41,000, but the volcanic material in this case was dated at 32 million years old. Now wait a minute, and there are many more examples you can find at ICR and other creation.com websites. Secularists don't actually publicize this too much, though you can find it in the secular literature. But here's the issue. If the dates of the rocks are never right when we can check the age, how can we be sure that they're correct when we don't know the age of the rock? You see, secularists will say, okay, yeah, we know we've got some anomalies and there's some problems here and there, but I've got this sample here, we have no idea when it was formed. You can trust the radiometric dating. Sorry, you want me to build an engineer a bridge or a truck or a tractor with those kind of assumptions that can never be confirmed? I'm not going to trust them. And I gave you some of the reasons, the assumptions, and this is actual experimental results. And the same rock, it can be dated by different methods, it gives different ages. And the rock's dated at one time by the same method, but different labs, it will give different results. They are not reliable. So if you base your theory on a wrong assumption, all your calculations, just like Jonah said in that quote, can be perfectly correct. Nothing wrong with them. But your assumptions are wrong, therefore your results are wrong and cannot be trusted. Okay, what did I do? Okay, I'm going to go through several other young Earth evidences, try to get this done in 15 minutes. Human population growth. We're told that humans evolved in their present form about 250,000 years ago. If that was true and you did any kind of simulation or basic calculations on population growth, you would have trillions and trillions of people. But we have about 8 billion. There's not enough people to account for 250,000 years of people. In fact, you can do the math, and if you just start with 8 people 4,500 years ago, take into account disease, famines, wars, plagues, you can get easily to the 8 billion, I guess it is, that we have today, or 7 billion, excuse me. Mutation rates from DNA indicates that our genome is also young. It confirms the population numbers. How many of you heard of soft biological tissue in dinosaurs? Okay, most of you have. We know that tissue cannot last. I'll mention some of these quicker. I'll go through rock strata. Helium in the atmosphere is a very interesting one, as well as deep rocks. And then I'm going to finish with planetary magnetic fields. So here's a little bit on the mitochondrial DNA, that the DNA studies show that these things are forming recently and actually can fit 6,000 years ago, and not the 200,000 years that they suggest. There are some interesting studies going on, including one that we talked about at dinner that just came out in the last month. I also mentioned soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Look, this is biological material inside a T-Rex leg bone. Since then, we found it in many other dinosaurs. There is no way collagen, biological proteins, even inside of a bone, can last for millions of years. Probably can't last for 100,000 years. And we're finding it all over. Any biology student in the first year knows how to do the test for proteins. They did it over and over again. Mary Schweitzer at North Carolina State was the first one to actually get published these results from the T-Rex. But since then, we've got soft tissue in Triceratops, hadrosaurs, and more. It's popping up all over, including the recent discovery of soft tissue in a Triceratops horn, of all places. The horn was very shallowly buried, discovered, it fell apart, but it was obvious a Triceratops horn, and it had soft tissue. We've got a video back there about it, and it can actually be stretched if you look at it. This is not stone. If it was 65 or more million years old, that biological tissue should have turned to dust and be gone, or totally solidified into a rock-hard fossil. But it's not. And there's a lot of other reasons to doubt believing that biological tissue can somehow last that long. Radon in the ground kills it. And then we've got DNA. In 2012, Dr. Schweitzer from North Carolina State then detected DNA in 3 different tests. And one of them detected the DNA in its double-stranded form. Now, it's not a lot. We're not going to clone any dinosaurs. But the fact is that DNA is a very fragile molecule. If this thing was 65 million years old, she should never have found any DNA. Certainly not both sides of a double helix. And what's neat, you know, God has a sense of humor. The same month she published this, over in England, a different scientific journal published a study on the decay rate of DNA. And one of their conclusions was, DNA cannot last for 100,000 years at normal temperatures as on the surface of the Earth, much less millions of years. You got DNA in a dinosaur bone, that's even better than the biological tissue. These samples, these bones cannot be millions of years old. Excellent indicator. And then basically when you get back to Lyell, if you believed in Charles Lyell and Varves and uniformitarian geology, how old would you say this rock cliff is? There's a person there in red, and so you're talking 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet rock cliff. Secularists would say, well, that has to be, a few hundreds of thousands of years old. Because it would take that long to form all those little layers, those little varves, you could see them, the sedimentary rock. Well, this is over at Mount St. Helens. The first layer was laid down in a matter of hours on May 18th, 1980. The second layer was laid down in an aftershock in 1980 in a matter of hours. And the third layer, when Mount St. Helens erupted again in 1982, was also laid down in a matter of hours. Mount St. Helens is a beautiful laboratory showing that these geological formations do not need millions of years to form. And then there's the issue of all the trees that ended up on top of Spirit Lake at the foot of Mount St. Helens. People have gone down there and examined them 30 years later, and these trees, after floating in a huge log mat on top of the Spirit Lake, they were living trees before May 1980. Then they were dead logs floating, and as they get waterlogged at one end, the trunk end, the bottom of the tree basically, gets heavier. The tree sinks to the bottom, plants itself in the bottom mud, usually vertically, pretty much, and in the matter of 30 years, they're petrifying. It doesn't take millions of years to get a petrified tree. Okay, I mentioned helium. Helium in the atmosphere and in granite. This is how helium atoms are formed when in the uranium to lead decay, okay? I'm going to try to do this fast, so keep up. But it goes through various phases every time a helium nucleus that eventually picks up its electrons is ejected. It's inside the rock, but helium is a very tiny atom, and it slips through the rock matrix. So I get all this helium, and it produces it. It doesn't want to stay long in the rocks. It migrates to the surface and comes up into the atmosphere. So if the Earth is billions of years old, and this decay process was going on at current rates for billions of years, then we should not find a lot of helium in the granite, or the crystals actually, in the rocks, but we should find a lot of helium in the atmosphere. After all, it's being released for millions of years, right? Now, a little bit is escaping to the outer space. It's so light. If it gets up there in the atmosphere, it doesn't all stay. But we still don't have enough. So as these things decay and the helium goes up into the atmosphere, there's just not enough there. In fact, people have calculated that the amount of helium is so little in the atmosphere, maybe the atmosphere is only 12,000 years old or less. Another number, like carbon-14, would say the atmosphere is less than 30,000 years old. But here's the really interesting one from granite. Inside the granite, there are zircons, tiny little crystals. And these crystals do have, this granite rock crystal has the uranium in it that's decaying to lead. In 1974, it was published in some geological journals, some of the samples from this very deep drilling rig, almost 1.8 miles deep. They pulled up samples, revealed what's in these crystals from deep in the earth, in rock that's supposedly billions of years old, and they got a lot of helium in them. So as this nuclear, that is these tiny amounts of uranium, is changing to lead, it's giving off at least 8 helium atoms by the time it gets to lead for every atom of uranium-238. Okay? The rock is supposed to be 1.5 billion years old, but it seemed like, there's still a lot of helium in these zircon crystals. It almost seems to be too much just with a quick mental check. So a study was done and commissioned. In fact, they study it because there's almost a phenomenal amount of helium in these zircons. So really, the question was, how fast can the helium get out of the zircon crystals, diffuse through the rock, and into the atmosphere? Okay? If it diffuses fast or quickly, then the amount of helium in the zircon should be young because there's too much there. I read the second scenario. But if it diffuses very slowly and needs lots of time, then that would indicate that, it still could be 1 billion years old because it takes so long for the helium to get out of there, and that's why it's old but still has a phenomenal amount of helium, okay? Got it? It's pretty straightforward. We got 2 different scenarios, but we have never measured the diffusion rate at this time through zircon crystals, so we did it. The rate team, in this case led by Dr. Russ Humphreys, a physicist, an award-winning physicist from Sandia National Labs, he started doing the predictions, and of course the temperature of the rock, and these are hot rocks that deep in the ground, they would have to have a diffusion rate really slow, and that's the purple points on this graph of how fast they diffuse with the temperature along the x-axis, okay? This is scenario 1, slow diffusion, and it could take 1.5 billion years and still have a lot of zircon in it because the diffusion rate is so slow. But if the diffusion rate is fast, as some people thought, and you did the math, in 6,000 years, if the rock was only 6,000 years old, I would need diffusion rates way up here, very fast, okay? That's the red line, okay? These were not experimental results. We didn't know the diffusion rate, but you could calculate what it would have to be on 2 scenarios. A very young rock or 1.5 billion years rock old, okay? So they sent these samples and they commissioned a well-respected laboratory to actually measure diffusion rates in zircon crystals. Nobody had done that before. Okay? The predictions were made in print before these studies were done. They used an existing mining company as an intermediary, just a blind sample. One of the world's best labs did this to measure diffusion rate in same-size zircons from the same borehole in the same rock formation. Very good experimental setup. So, if you believe in long ages, and nobody had an idea, this was truly a blind experiment, whether you believed in them or not. And they were waiting, they didn't get the data until 2003. Dr. Humphreys talks about how anxious they were. Because remember, he put his predictions in print. Quick review, here's his predictions. The diffusion rate, way up here, is fast. based on 6,000-year-old rock. Down below in purple, diffusion rate, if they were truly 1.5 billion years old, then the diffusion rate would be in this range. And there wouldn't be much mix-up because these are off by a factor of 100,000, okay, on this scale. Where do you think the data came in? You're a kind audience. Remember, these predictions were put in print on what they should be based on the two different scenarios of the age of the rock. The data came back from the independent lab on the blue dots. Look at that. That blue dots are the hard data of what the diffusion rate is at different temperatures, and it fits beautifully with the 6,000-year-old graph prediction. Do you think Dr. Humphreys and the team got a Nobel Prize for this? This is big in science. You make a prediction like this with totally radical results that could have occurred, and then you get the results. And one of your predictions is exactly right. He should have got a Nobel Prize. Oh, but it was the wrong answer. They didn't like it. This is hardcore science. Making predictions, getting measurements, doing laboratory work. These rocks have too much helium, and the diffusion rate indicates the rocks are 6,000 years old, give or take. And the billion-year answer, you would have had data off by a factor of 100,000. Nobel Prize material. See, there's not been enough time for helium to diffuse out of the granite. The measured diffusion rate is fast, and it matches the young Earth prediction. It fails the old Earth prediction. This is big stuff. Why haven't we heard about it on the 5 o'clock news? I'm an engineer. I'm going to go with the data. The data says the evolutionary model of billions of years is being falsified. I can't trust the radiometric dating. Carbon-14 eliminates billions of years. And now I've got this. Wow. No wonder this little guy says, oh, I'm young after all. Here's the rate team. And I got just a couple of minutes. I'm going to run through final topic of magnetic fields, planetary magnetic fields. Dr. Humphreys, by the way, grew up in a non-Christian home. He didn't become a Christian until he was a grad student at LSU. And he did a lot of study as a physicist. He was interested in magnetic fields and what forms them. And he realized that Earth's magnetic field is decaying fast. Now, secularists do have some excuses for it, but they really don't hold water scientifically when you get into the details, and Humphreys has answered all those. The best explanation, that Earth's magnetic field is decaying so fast that it's less than probably only about 10,000 years old as an upper number. The decay rate of Earth's magnetic field is such it cannot be millions of years old, even with reversals and all other things. In fact, the reversal actually weakens the magnetic field every time it reverses. And then there's the outer planets. Here's some background on Dr. Humphreys. In 1977, and I was watching this stuff when I was pretty young, but aware of all this. I loved the spacecraft, the space exploration, the Apollo program. We launched the Voyager 2 probe in 1977. Didn't get to Uranus until 1986. So on the way, it discovered 10 new moons and 2 rings around Uranus. But in that time, in the 80s, physicists of all kinds were trying to make predictions in print of what they thought the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune were going to be once we got data from the Voyager 2 spacecraft. Okay? And people were doing that. Humphreys put it in print. And when we got the data, Humphreys' model was the only one that was right. Humphreys' model on planetary magnetic fields and his prediction of Uranus and Neptune was based on a 6,000-year-old solar system. The NASA scientists and everybody else made their calculations based on billions of year old solar system and planets. And they were off by factors of 100,000 to 1,000,000. Do you think Dr. Humphreys got the Nobel Prize for this? Doing predictions in print, and then he's the only one right? See, our whole solar system looks to be only 6,000 years old. And there's so much more. We've got the material back there by Spike Thesaurus. I got 3 astronomy DVDs back there. Awesome stuff. He should have got the Nobel Prize, making a prediction like this one for that too. And then he did it again. Early on, we had Mariner in 1976 went to Mercury. Now, Mercury is so small, and under the assumption it's so old, it shouldn't even have a magnetic field. If it had one when it formed, that should have worn away eons ago. And yet, in 1975, Mariner detected a magnetic field at Mercury. Well, in 2008, we sent the MESSENGER probe back to Mercury and took some more measurements of the magnetic field along with other scientific data. And this was written up. Now, before 2008, and we got more data in 2011, Humphreys again made a prediction of if this was Mercury's magnetic field, which shouldn't have been there, but it was, but if this is what it was in 1970s, by the 2000s, it should be drastically less because it's only a 6,000-year-old planet. And he made this also in print. 2008, we got more measurements, and then we got even better ones in 2011. And again, Dr. Humphreys' magnetic field is fading fast based on a young solar system. Here's some of the data. Magnetic field moment arm is out here and to the left. Here's the data with the experimental error range in 1975. And MESSENGER came in here on the far right, way outside of the experimental error between the 2 measurements. You've got a fast declining magnetic field at Mercury. And in fact, when we got 2011 data, Mercury's magnetic field is weakened by 8% in only 36 years, an astonishingly fast decrease for a planet that shouldn't even have one, especially if it's billions of years old. So the fast rate of decay, half-life of 320 years, implies the crust was magnetized only a few thousand years. So Mercury, it has a magnetic field and shouldn't, and its rate of decline, the magnetic field, is consistent with the 6,000-year-old solar system. Isn't that amazing? Why wasn't that on the 6 o'clock news? Keith Wanzer, a PhD in condensed matter physics, sums it up this way. He says, "I'm convinced there is far more evidence for a recent 6-day creation and global flood than there is for an old Earth and evolution." And he's got a PhD. He's not in the majority opinion, but I'm trying to show you he's got data, experimental data on his side. These are not just my opinions. This is experimental data in all kinds of areas. If you'd like to know more about evidence of the age of the Earth, a couple of websites I can recommend, pathlights.com. They got fairly well documented 58 evidences. And then Dr. Humphreys put together 101 evidences at creation.com. Just type in age of the Earth or 101 evidences, you'll find it. See, there are scientists, PhD scientists from top universities around the world that agree with Keith Wanzer that this planet cannot be billions of years old. The Earth has not been scientifically proven. I tried to tell you that at the beginning. It was always just an assumption. The Bible does talk about a little 6-day creation only thousands of years ago, and the assumptions or doubt about Noah's flood, that's what led to Darwin's theory, and it's needed to protect Darwinism. That's why so many people get emotional about questioning billions of years, no matter what the data says, because if I lose billions of years, nobody's going to believe in Darwin anymore. And that undermines everything in the secular world. New evidence, nuclear decay, DNA, astronomy, shows Earth and the solar system cannot be billions of years old. And many PhD scientists believe this. Folks, as Psalm 118 says, it's better to trust in the Lord than in men. Where are you going to put your confidence? Thank you. Got a question?